Thanks. I mean, I think capitalism is the most brutal and violent system that has ever been in history. In the 19th century, the revolutionary Karl Marx wrote that capitalism was born into the world dripping from head to toe and from every pore with blood and dirt. And when Marx wrote those words, we had not seen the millions dead in the First and Second World Wars. We had not seen the birth of nuclear weapons, which saw the wiping out of two whole cities in Japan at the end of the Second World War, or the hundreds of conflicts that have taken place ever since. Today, there are currently 43 conflicts raging across the world, from Africa to Asia to the Middle East. There has not been a single day of fighting without war since the end of the Second World War. And you only have to look at the news in the last couple of weeks to see how that affects the society that we live in. In Libya, for instance, a country that was bombed by the US, by Britain, by France, and where there's absolute chaos now, we saw the consequences of that. You saw modern-day slave auctions taking place where young black men were being sold for the equivalent of a couple of hundred pounds, or a couple of hundred pounds. And I think you can see when it comes to these conflicts that are taking place, whether that's Trump threatening nuclear war with North Korea, or whether that's the chaos that you can see in Syria with various factions fighting it out with the US and Russia backing different sides within that war. It can seem like these conflicts are all driven by very local reasons, by very specific dynamics. So we're told that the wars in the Middle East are caused by a clash of civilizations between Western liberal democracy and Islam within the Middle East. We're told, not even in the right-wing press, but the liberal press, the likes of The Guardian, that the confrontation between Trump and North Korea isn't anything to do with capitalism or imperialism. It's to do with two quote-unquote madmen fighting it out amongst one another. And I think there's also an argument taking place about these conflicts is how should revolutionaries, how should socialists respond? The pressure around the Syrian war was either to say, well, look, there's people dying under both American and Russian bombs, and therefore surely something must be done. Surely the West must launch some kind of humanitarian mission. Of course, we think Iraq was a bad idea, but something must be done about Syria. The flip side of that was to say, well, we can see the horrors of Western imperialism and what it's done to the Middle East, whether that's in Iraq or Syria, and therefore, surely, Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator, not a very nice guy, but shouldn't really we back him against what the West is doing? And I think if we have to sort of try and navigate all these kind of different conflicts, we have to try and come up with a framework of how to actually explain what's taking place, so then we can put forward a socialist position about how we respond to taking on war. So I'm not going to talk about the specifics of what Trump is doing with North Korea, or what's going on in the Middle East, although people want to bring that out in the discussion. I think that will be a good thing. But I think what I want to do is sort of take a step back and look at a general framework of what can explain these conflicts, and also ask the sort of more fundamental question of, can we have a world without the brutalities of war, or the sort of wars that we've seen? And from a Marxist perspective, war is caused by imperialism. Now, imperialism is not simply about, stronger states dominating weaker states. We've seen that throughout history, whether that was ancient Rome or ancient Greece, whether that was in the medieval ages, one always had this dynamic of stronger powers seeking to dominate weaker powers. And that's absolutely a part of the system that we see today. America simply going into the Middle East and saying what we say goes. Trump firing threatening to fire nuclear weapons at North Korea. That was a declaration to say that we're America, we're the strongest power in the world, and you have to do what we say, otherwise there'll be consequences. So that sort of brute force of the stronger against the weaker is absolutely part of it. But I think when it comes to what causes war specifically, like the ones we're seeing today, we have to say that imperialism under capitalism is something quite specific, and war is linked precisely to, war in the modern era is linked precisely to capitalism and flows out of it. And when it comes to Marxist understanding of what causes war, imperialism, there were some key writings that were key writings. So you had Vladimir Lenin, Nikolai Bukharin, Rosa Luxemburg. Now, some of these were on the reading list for the day school, and I think it's important to say that when people like Lenin came up with developed the Marxist theory of imperialism, this wasn't something that they simply got from Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels and that was handed down to them. They developed this because they were responding to developments within the world that were taking place. The First World War, the colonization of Africa. And that's quite an important point, because Marxism is not some kind of dogma where you can just take what Karl Marx said and then apply it to the modern world. We have to use that kind of method that he developed and to try and explain what's going on today. And that's what today is also about. It's about trying to grapple with Marxist ideas so we can apply them to the arguments that come up on campus, within workplaces, when you're on stalls, all of these sorts of questions. And when it comes to Lenin's theory of imperialism, I think it's important to say that he called it a popular outline. So he wasn't saying that everything within this book on imperialism is going to fit for all eternity. And if you read it, and I would recommend it, a lot of it doesn't actually apply to the modern world. But that general framework that he developed, which I'm going to talk about, is what I think we need to take from those take from those writings. And when it comes to arguments today, I think it's important to say that imperialism is not just about who is the biggest bully on the block, who is dropping the most bombs, who is firing the most bullets. So if one looks at what's taking place in Syria, clearly, at the moment, the most bombs were being dropped by Russia. They were the ones that were sort of murdering the most civilians in the last couple of years. Now, does that mean that because Russia's dropping the most bombs, therefore one says, okay, they're the worst evil in this situation, so America and what the West is doing is some kind of counterbalance to that? This was the liberal argument, even like The Guardian, who said, oh look, Russia and Putin, the Russian president, he's a nasty guy. You might not like Trump, you might not like what America does, but essentially, come on, we have to get behind our own country and what they're doing to confront the greater evil within Russia. And I think for us it's important to say that's not what imperialism is simply about. It's not about just one power going in there. Imperialism for us, fundamentally, I think we have to see it as a world system of competing capitalist states. And look at how this sort of world system came about. So I think when capitalism first began developing it really took hold in the 19th century, it was essentially, grouped around small clusters, around Manchester, around Lancashire, different, in the Netherlands, small parts of the world. And you had a whole number of capitalist, hundreds of capitalist firms, enterprises competing with one another. The biggest workplace in the 1830s, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, the cotton mills of Lancashire employed around 130 people. Today, the biggest workplaces are, employ thousands of people. And so you had these small number of firms competing for essentially what was an undefined world market. Africa hadn't yet been colonized, capitalism hadn't developed there. Large parts of Asia, capitalism hasn't developed. So essentially, you have this system of competing capitalist firms. As capitalism then grows and develops, you see capital spills across national boundaries. So, you have the growth of now multinational corporations. McDonald's is the second largest employer in the whole of the world. That pales in comparison to the size of firms when capitalism was first coming about. And there was an argument actually amongst Marxists, but also amongst sort of the right and the left about what this would mean. And one of the more right-wing arguments was to say, well, if you have capital spilling across national boundaries, therefore that's going to make war less likely. There was a right-winger in the 1990s called Thomas Friedman, and he said, well, actually, we're going to see the end of war in the 20th and 21st century because no two countries that have McDonald's in one another are going to go to war against each other, because obviously that would destroy one of the McDonald's, and that would be bad for the capitalists who own McDonald's. A year after he wrote that, Western bombs were raining down on Belgrade in Yugoslavia, and you saw one of the most bloodiest conflicts in Europe in recent history. This was also an argument from a German Marxist called Karl Kautsky. He called this ultra-imperialism, where he said because you had capitalism across the world, capitalists would seek to cooperate to protect their profits, and they wouldn't go to war against one another. He wrote that in 1914. Two months later, after he published that book, you have the beginning of the First World War, one of the biggest imperialist conflicts in the whole of human history, millions dead. And because what you get alongside this sort of capitalism spilling across the world, you see that these individual firms are swallowed up, swallow each other up, and instead of hundreds of small firms competing, you've got large monopolies that dominate sort of the world market. And as capitalist firms grow, they rely more on the state. So multinational corporations, they like to talk about how they can just move across the world and you don't need the state anymore. That's not true, actually. Multinational corporations absolutely rely on national states to project their interests within the world. Oil corporations rely on the American state to protect their interests in the Middle East and in different parts of the world. So the state and capitalist firms are becoming more reliant on one another. And this gives rise to this system of competition amongst capitalist firms becomes competition amongst rival capitalist states. And the reason that this can sometimes lead to war is because, unlike that sort of fantasy about two countries which have a McDonald's not going to war with one another, the problem is that capitalism does not develop evenly across the world. It's not the case that you have capitalist development, each country is as rich as the next one, as rich as the next one. And therefore, because capitalism develops unevenly, because you've got inequality amongst these capitalist states built into the system, they're going to try and do each other over. So therefore, the weaker states are going to try and grab a bigger share of the profit, and therefore are going to try and get to the top of the world food chain. So because of that inequality, competition amongst states is built into the imperialist system. So if you think about what's going on today, the United States has been still is the biggest military superpower, but for a long time it was the biggest economic power, certainly after the Second World War. Today, it's facing increasing competition from the likes of China. Now, if you went along with the Thomas Friedman, we're all going to cooperate theory, well, China and America would be working together. But because China is still trying to catch up with the United States, because of that inequality in the world system, that it's driven forward, that there's a conflict is driven forward by that sort of competition that takes place within it. And these rival powers struggle to divide and redivide the world amongst one another. And Lenin sort of said it that capitalists and imperialists, they don't divide the world out of personal malice, although a lot of them aren't very nice people. They divide the world because capitalism has reached that stage of development where they have to try and divide that world in order to get more profit. Because if they don't, then another country is going to try and do that. Example is Iraq. The United States doesn't actually need oil from Iraq. 50% of oil of the oil that the United States uses is imported from the Western Hemisphere, including Venezuela. Until 1979, the United States was self-sufficient in oil, from Texas and these sort of places. So therefore, it's not just about using resources for itself. The problem is that Iraq and the Middle East is what has one of the largest deposits of oil within the world. And whoever controls that area of the world controls the tap on the world economy, because oil is incredibly important in terms of manufacturing all the other kind of products that you see in terms of energy, plastics, and all that sort of thing. Therefore, if the United States didn't control that, therefore, China is now trying to get a slice of the action in Iraq. You've got Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia is also trying. So it's this you can see this sort of competition for who is on the top of that world scale is what drives that system forward. So how can we try and apply this sort of analysis to what's taking place today? And I think specifically what's important to look at is what's happened to the United States during the last 50, 60 years. Because at the end of the Cold War, which was an inter-imperialist conflict between Russia and the United States, at the end of the Cold War, the United States was the only superpower left standing. You know, Russia collapsed, essentially it broke apart into all the various different republics, the military was in tatters, the oil industry was in tatters, so, you know, the United States seemed like it could do anything. And George Walker Bush Sr., George Bush's father, he stood up on a tank at the end of the first Gulf War in 1991. And there's been so many Iraq wars now. He stood up and said, "What we say goes." And certainly, on the surface, it looked like America could dictate what was taking place. But actually, the situation was much more complex than the United States thought. So there's a serial war criminal. I don't often quote serial war criminals in meetings, but a guy called Henry Kissinger, who was national security chief for Richard Nixon, another right-wing racist US president. And he was the man who was responsible for carpet bombing Vietnam, Cambodia during the 1970s. And he said, well, hang on a minute. Whilst America is the strongest superpower militarily, in the coming years, America will face economic competition from the likes of China, from Iran, Saudi Arabia, other regional powers on a scale that we've never seen before. And that's what we're seeing play out within the world today. That's why there is growing competition and rivalry in Asia, in the Middle East. It's because whilst America, certainly is strong militarily and is lashing out more to try and maintain that control, it's facing a lot more competition than it was during the 1960s, 1970s, even the early 1990s. In order to try and get over that fundamental economic weakness, what the United States tried to do is to say, right, well, we're going to use brute military force to try and overcome economic weakness. And that's what the Iraq War was about. They thought, if we can go into the Middle East, win a quick war, install a puppet regime within the region, that's going to send a signal out to all those countries that are competing with us economically, mainly China, that actually we're still number one and what we say goes. Problem was that the Iraq War was a complete and utter defeat for the United States. It thought it could go in there and win quickly. Instead, despite the surge in troops in 2007, you see that actually, first of all, you have the rise of a sectarian civil war. You get the rise of what was known as ISIS coming out of that sectarianism, an incredibly weak government that has to rely on Iran, which was an enemy of the United States, to actually prop it up. And therefore, the United States is severely weakened as a result of the Iraq War. And instead of sending a signal to its allies which says, we're still number one, the likes of China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, all now get the signal, actually, it's possible to defeat American imperialism. It's possible to actually try and grab a larger slice of the world cake, because America is no longer the power that it used to be. And what that means is that right across the world, specifically in the Middle East and Asia, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, is you can see growing competition between multiple different powers taking place. So Syria, for example, is not just about the United States bombing Syria or Russia bombing Syria. There were 14 different imperialist powers were bombing Syria because they all were trying to redivide that part of the world, because it's got the largest deposits of oil in the world, and whoever controls that has a big say over the world economy. So you can see that imperialist competition now is much more about not just one power like the United States. You can see that it is this world system of competing capitalist states, like what Lenin was describing at the beginning of the 20th century. Similarly, if one looks at what's taking place in Asia, the conflict was always between Trump and North Korea was always presented as, Trump, he's just a bit out there, so is Kim Jong-un, that's why this is taking place. Actually, the background to the confrontation over North Korea is a much bigger conflict that's taking place, with China trying to assert itself within the region, specifically around in the South China Sea. The reason is that the South China Sea, $3 trillion worth of shipping goes through there every year. Whoever controls that part of the world has a big say over where profits within the world economy will go. So therefore, China, the United States, the Philippines, Indonesia are all trying to muscle in to try and actually gain control of that, which is giving rise to some, really quite situations which seem irrational. So, for example, China at the moment, around around a group of rocks, not islands but rocks, called the Spratly Islands, is dredging up sand from beneath the sea to try and make those rocks bigger. Why is that? Because under the international law of the sea, if it's a rock, you control 80 kilometers around it. If it's an island, you can control 200 kilometers around it. So, countries are actually building fake islands to assert their imperialist dominance of certain parts of the world. That's what this system of competing capitalist states leads to. And at the moment, I think it's incredibly dangerous, because when you have, this growing number of states trying to muscle in on this, that means that war is actually much more likely. Now, that's not to say that Trump is going to press the big red button tomorrow, or that we're going to see war is going to suddenly break out tomorrow. But what it does mean, when there's increased competition among states, that means that a little thing can actually spark off a much wider conflict. One thinks of the First World War. Germany, what was then Austria-Hungary, Russia, Britain, they were competing for the last 50 years before the First World War for trade routes, for domination of Africa, and they hadn't gone to a world war. It took the assassination in Sarajevo, relatively small thing, to then light the fuse underneath this underlying economic rivalry, which then set off one of the biggest imperialist conflicts within the world. So I think we can use this is the kind of general framework that we can help us explain those kind of conflicts. What does that mean for us as socialists when it comes to opposing this imperialist system? Because I think there's all sorts of arguments going on the left, not necessarily new ones, but ones that are rumbling on, which is to say, how does one actually oppose imperialism? For a long time, because America was the dominant military superpower within the world, a lot of people within the anti-war movement thought of America as essentially the only evil. And therefore, if America does something against someone else, whether that's Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator, therefore, surely we have to back Assad against America. Or, America is trying to expand NATO, the military alliance, into Eastern Europe. Putin, the Russian president, is opposing that, who's also then trying to stoke up conflict. But America's the main enemy. Don't really talk about what Russia's doing. They're the lesser evil in all of this. And I think that's a wrong approach, because for us, what ran through Lenin's opposition to imperialism was fundamentally based on our vision of socialism, which is about working class people being the agents of change, working class people emancipating themselves. So you don't look to another power to bring liberation or to oppose imperialism. It has to be about working class people fighting back against that system. And what Lenin developed was the idea that how do you try and strike a blow against it? It's to say the main enemy is at home. And when Lenin came up with this idea, people said to him, well, how can the main enemy be at home? So the main enemy of the working class people in Britain is the British government, the main enemy of working class people in Germany is the German government, and so on and so forth. How can this be true? If we all just oppose one another, each other's government, how can we be for everyone losing, essentially? And he said, well, look, because the main division for us, from our perspective, isn't between the British versus Germany or Britain versus Syria. It's between the ruling class and the working class. And when we say the main enemy is at home, it's about saying that their side can lose and our side can win. And it's about what we want to do is turn the war between the bosses into a war against the bosses system. So when it comes to the war in Syria, for example, we are not absolutely against what Russia is doing within Syria. We are against them propping up the Assad dictatorship. We're against what they're doing there. But because our enemy is the British government is the one that we can strike a blow against. They're the ones that we can bring down. Therefore, we have to. The main focus for us has to be pointing towards the hypocrisy and the crimes of Western imperialism, and hopefully, if we are able to bring down our own government, if we're able to strike a blow against our own government's imperialist policies, then that can then link up with what other people are doing within Russia who are going to fight against their government, and so on and so forth. The second point is we also have to support another way to strike a blow against imperialism is to support movements for national liberation. I think that's incredibly important. And Lenin again was quite clear about this. He said, you have to assess it from the standpoint of the working class. And what he meant by this was to say we support national liberation movements if they are going to strike a blow against imperialism. Freedom for Palestine would strike a massive blow against imperialism because Israel is a key state within the Middle East which is used by Britain and used by the US to control that part of the world. So freedom for Palestine from the river to the sea would strike a massive blow against imperialism. Why are we for a united Ireland? It's because actually, as one of Britain's oldest colonies in Northern Ireland, to actually break up the remnants of the decaying British state would be a good thing, because if the British state is weaker, it's in a much weaker position to drop bombs on the Middle East. It's a much weaker position to try and be the lackeys of US imperialism. So we have to look at those kind of concrete things about how we can oppose it. And when it comes to just how does that translate into everyday sort of activity? I think we have to, any point where we can point out those hypocrisies. So when they say, what are you going to do about the war in Syria or the war in Libya? People are dying. Doesn't the West have to do something? Well, we can say, well, look, there's a very simple thing that one can do is open the borders and let the refugees in who are fleeing the result of Western wars within the first place. That's a very concrete way of saying, look, you're to blame for this, and actually if you really cared, then that's what you should be doing, as opposed to adding to that conflict. And I think we have to sort of do all those sort of things, but running throughout that has to be an argument about changing society, because it is possible to have a world without wars. But what we have to do for that is, fight against them and oppose them when they come up. But we also have to fight against that system of competing capitalist states which gives rise to war within the first place, and link it to the much bigger question of how do we fundamentally transform society to one that is about meeting people's needs and not the needs of the profits of the people at the top.